Gospel according to St. Luke, the 5th chapter.
Glory to you, O Lord.
Once while Jesus was standing beside the lake of Gennesaret, and the crowd was pressing in on him to hear the word of God, he saw 2 boats there at the shore of the lake. The fishermen had gone out of them and were washing their nets. He got into one of the boats, the one belonging to Simon, and asked him to put out a little way from the shore. Then he sat down and taught the crowds from the boat. When he had finished speaking, he said to Simon, "Put out into the deep water and let down your nets for a catch." Simon answered, "Master, we have worked all night long, but have caught nothing. Yet if you say so, I will let down the nets." When they had done this, they caught so many fish that their nets were beginning to break. So they signaled their partners in the other boat to come and help them, and they came and filled both boats so that they began to sink. But when Simon Peter saw it, he fell down at Jesus' knees, saying, "Go away from me, Lord, for I am a sinful man." For he and all who were with him were amazed at the catch of fish that they had taken, and so also were James and John, sons of Zebedee, who were partners with Simon. Then Jesus said to Simon, "Do not be afraid. From now on you will be catching people." When they had brought their boats to shore, they left everything and followed him. This is the gospel of the Lord.
Praise to you, Lord Christ.
Please be seated. For years now, there has been a humorous job description of a pastor that's been circulating, especially when churches are in the midst of calling a new pastor. The job description goes on to describe the perfect pastor. And it's as follows. The perfect pastor preaches 10 minutes, always uses the most exciting of illustrations and the most engaging of stories. He or she is the perfect pastor, condemns sin roundly, but never ever hurts anyone's feelings. The perfect pastor is about 32 years of age, but has like 40 years of experience. And the perfect pastor is good looking and healthy and somebody who has never ever done anything grievous, anything really bad, never offended anybody, and never ever has forgotten anyone's name. The perfect pastor is someone who knows when somebody in the congregation is sick and needs a visit without ever having been told. And the perfect pastor is someone who has a burning desire to work with youth, while at the same time spends all their time with senior citizens and has the charisma to connect with all of them. And the list goes on and on and on of this job description of the perfect pastor. It's also been joked that in today's modern age, with all the expectations that churches have today, and with all the legal liabilities that surround us in churches, that the Apostle Paul would never get the call to be a pastor in a modern church today. Paul almost alludes to this a little bit in our epistle lesson as you listen to him talk about his call to be an apostle and how he recognizes the fact that he was unfit to be one called to be a servant of Jesus, and yet God called him anyway. Think a little bit about St. Paul's life and ministry. He was imprisoned many times. He stood by, probably applauded, while Stephen was being stoned to death. And Paul, before he was converted to Christ, was one who was persecuting the church. There are followers of Paul who have labeled him as mentally unbalanced because of his following of Jesus. And he wasn't the most stable guy in the world. He didn't stay at one church for any length of time. He moved from place to place to place to place. And yet God chose Paul with all of those problems, all of those things that might disqualify him today from being a pastor in the church. God chose Paul to be one of the most important messengers of the gospel in the New Testament. And that's God's point to us today as we gather together. That the call of God and God's leading hand often goes beyond our wildest dreams and our expectations. There are times, I think, when we see the hand of God leading us, or God calling out to us, that we're wondering what is going on, and our initial reaction is one to hesitate, not to follow the leading hand of God. We see an example of this today in the gospel lesson as Jesus encounters once again those fishermen apostles, Simon, as we also know as Peter, and James and John. And on today's occasion, as we just heard, Jesus comes to them and he asks them to push the boat out so he can preach to the crowds that had been following him and crowding him. So by being pushed out in the boat and being on the water, they could be on the seashore. He'd have the natural sound effects, the echo that would come off the water so that people could hear him preaching. And once he finishes with his message, then Jesus says to those fishermen apostles, "Let your nets out again." And we see in the initial response that Peter in particular, for a moment, thinks Jesus is a little bit crazy. See, they've been fishing all night. They hadn't caught a thing. They were tired, they were wet, they were hungry, they were ready to go home and go to bed, I'm sure. So at first, Peter tells Jesus something he already knows. We've been doing this all night and we haven't caught anything. But then Peter realizes, because he's already seen enough of Jesus to know there's something special about Jesus, he realizes that it's important for him to acquiesce and listen to what Jesus says. So he does. And they let down the nets, and as we hear from the reading, they catch more fish than they could even hold in their boats, to the point that the boats were beginning to sink. The greatest of all catches they caught. And this sets up Jesus telling them that they're now going to be fishers of people. They're going to go out and do the job of the kingdom and the job of the gospel. But isn't that reaction of Peter oftentimes our reaction when we feel like God is leading us in a certain direction? At first we're like, this is a little bit crazy. But then maybe we get out of God's way and we let God do what God has to do. You just heard the beautiful presentation about the schoolhouse across the parking lot, and it was a little bit over a year ago. It was the end of January last year that this whole transition process started to take effect, when the announcement was first made that Lou Day was closing. And I have to admit that when that first happened, I very much felt like Peter's first reaction in the gospel lesson today. Immediately I started asking those questions. Now what? What are we going to do with the properties? What are we going to do in those places? I immediately wondered what was going to happen with the grounds, like the beautiful new playground and the turf field, and I was afraid all that was going to go to waste. And so I started to make my mental checklist of what we may or may not do in the future. And if you had told me a year ago that today our campus would look like it does today, I would have told you that you were absolutely crazy. Because for me, one of the last things that we were going to put over in the school building again was another school. Because we'd been down that road before. And as a matter of fact, when John and Mimosa first called the church office and talked to Jill, and then Jill talked to me, I mentally put them way down at the bottom of the list of people I was going to consider and talk to. But I very quickly learned through this process that it was important for me to set aside my own need for control and my own desires and expectations, and to get out of God's way and let God lead us. And once I did that, incredible things started to happen. Even before the school year ended, we were approached by YDA about the use of the youth building and the playgrounds and the turf field, one of my first worries of the whole thing. And they wanted to use it for their work to the community. And then as we went through the process with the school building, we looked at things like the CO of the building. We looked at the legal ramifications of the different groups that might use the building. And as we talked with the various groups, it became clear and evident that God was leading us back in the direction from which we came. But isn't that the point of the way God works in our lives? That it's not about our initial reactions like Peter's in the gospel lesson. It's about God being a God of second chances and new opportunities. And that's why we stand where we stand today. Just a little over a year from when that news first hit. Over the last few years, there's been a pretty effective commercial on television for Capital One credit cards where Samuel L. Jackson or Jennifer Garner asked, "What's in your wallet?" It harkens back to the days of the old American Express commercials. If you remember that, they told us to don't leave home without it. Those commercials are aimed at seeing where our financial health is, and that financial health and prosperity is a sign of what's in your wallet. Well, today, in a certain sense, God is talking to us about our spiritual health and our spiritual prosperity. And as God does that, God's asking us the question, what's in your net? And the answer for us is in the reminder of the fact that throughout the history of the Scriptures and the work of salvation that God does for us, God has called some of the least qualified people to serve the kingdom of heaven. People like Isaiah and Paul and Moses and all the others that we know from scriptural history. And God continues to call us today to trust in his leading hand with our warts and all. So the question is, do we allow ourselves to control how God works in our lives with our own expectations and our own thoughts? Or do we get out of God's way and let God's opportunity at second chances overcome our first reactions? Because when we do that, when we let God lead us by the gifts of word and sacrament, God promises to fill our nets with exactly what we need.